boys and girls. Happy Wednesday. I emailed your parents yesterday and I told them this, but if they didn't tell you yesterday, I went into school and I cleaned out your desk and I put everything that was in your desk in a bag. And then you guys will get that bag later on. I didn't throw like things in your desk away, except if it was obviously trash. So like little pieces of paper I threw away. But there were some of you had like notes in there from like siblings. And I kept those for you. I thought those were very sweet. So, yeah, cleaned out your desk yesterday, started cleaning the room, and I missed you already, but then I did that, and that just made me miss you guys like 100 times more. So, all that to say, I love you guys, and I miss you very, very much. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start with BFG. So we ended with the queen was having her dream and she was yelling, no, 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 stop them, stop them. Okay, and that's where we stopped. She's having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be horrid. I feel so sorry for her, but it has to be done. After that, there were a few moans. Then there was a long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. She was terrified that she would see the man with the dog down at the garden staring up at her. But the garden was deserted. A pale summer mist hung over it like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large, funny-shaped lake at the far end. There was an island in the lake, and there were ducks swimming on the water. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob being turned. She heard someone entering the room. I think I read that the other day, but that's okay. Good morning, Your Majesty, a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause and then a slight rattle of china and silver. And china is just like plates, like fine china. It's plates and maybe teacups. Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table? Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened. This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on the radio and the television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well-known voice. Whatever is it, ma'am? I just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful. Oh, I am so sorry, ma'am, but don't be distressed. You're awake now and it will go away. It was only a dream, ma'am. Do you know what I dreamt, Mary? I dreamt that boys and girls were being snatched out of their beds at boarding school and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. One lot from a girls' school and another from a boys' school. It was all so vivid, Mary. It was so real. There was silence. Sophie waited. She was quivering with excitement. But why the silence? Why didn't the other one, the maid, why didn't she say something? Well, what on earth is the matter, Mary? The famous voice of the queen was saying. There was another silence. Mary, you've gone as white as a sheet. Are you feeling ill? The queen asked. There was suddenly a crash and a clatter, which could only have meant the tray that the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. Mary, the famous voice was saying rather sharply, I think you'd better sit down at once. You look as though you're going to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard just because I had an awful dream. That isn't the reason, ma'am. The maid's voice was quivering terribly. Then for heaven's sake, what is the reason? Oh, I'm so very sorry about the tray, ma'am. I'm so very sorry. Oh, don't you worry about the tray, but what on earth is it that made you drop it? Why did you go white as a ghost all of a sudden? You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am? No. What do they say? Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. It's It's like the very dream you had in the night, ma'am." "Rubbish, Mary. Where is that paper?" "Here it is, ma'am. It's on the headlines." "Great Scott!" cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanished mysteriously from their beds at Rodian School? 14 boys disappear? Bones are found underneath dormitory windows?" Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested. "Oh, how ghastly!" the famous voice cried out. "It's absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows? What can have happened? Oh, those poor children." "But, ma'am, don't you see, ma'am?" "See what, Mary?" "Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dreamt it, ma'am." "Not by giants, Mary." "No, ma'am, but the bit about the girls and the boys disappearing from their dormitories. You dreamt it so clearly, and then it actually happened. That's why I came over all faint, ma'am." "Well, I'm coming up a little bit over faint myself, Mary." "It gives me the shakes, ma'am. When something like this happens, it really does." "Well, I don't blame you one bit, Mary." I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and I will have this mess cleared up." "No, don't go, Mary. Stay here a moment." Sophie wished she could see into the room, but she didn't dare touch the curtains. The famous voice began speaking again. "I really did dream about those children, Mary. It was clear as a crystal." "I know you did, ma'am." "I don't know how giants got into it, though. That's just rubbish." "Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? Then we shall all feel better. It's a very lovely day." "Please do." What do you think they're going to discover behind the curtain? Be thinking about that in your head. With a swish, the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze to the window ledge. The queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there, staring wide-eyed and white-faced at the small girl who was perched on her windowsill in her PJs. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the queen looked petrified too. One would have expected her to look surprised, as you or I would have done had we discovered a small girl sitting on our windowsill first thing in the morning. But the queen didn't look surprised. She looked genuinely frightened. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on top of her head, was the first to recover. "What in the name of heaven do you think you're doing here?" she shouted angrily at Sophie. Sophie looked beseechingly towards the queen for help. The queen was still staring at Sophie. Gaping at her would be more accurate. Her mouth was slightly opened. Her eyes were round and wide as two saucers, and the whole of that famous, rather lovely face was filled with disbelief. "Now, listen here, young lady. How on earth did you get into this room?" the maid shouted furiously. "I don't believe it," the queen said. "I simply don't believe it." Okay, what do you think the queen is saying that about? What doesn't she believe right now? Be thinking about what her dream was supposed to be. "I'll take her out, ma'am, at once," the maid said. "No, Mary, no, don't do that." The queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken aback. She turned at her and stared at the queen. What on earth had come over her? It looked as though she was in a state of shock. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the queen was asking. When the queen spoke again, it was in a strange, strangled sort of whisper. "Tell me, Mary," she said. "Tell me quite truthfully. Is there really a little girl sitting on my windowsill? Or Am I still dreaming? She is sitting there all right, ma'am, as clear as the daylight, but heavens only knows how she got there. Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming at this time. But that's exactly what I did dream, the Queen cried out. I dreamt that as well. I dreamt there would be a little girl sitting on my windowsill in her nightgown, and she would be talking to me. The maid, with her hands clasped over her starched white shirt, was staring at her mistress with a look of absolute disbelief on her face. The situation was getting beyond her. She was lost. She had not been trained to cope with this kind of madness. Are you real? The Queen asked to Sophie. Yes, Your Majesty, Sophie murmured. What is your name? Sophie, Your Majesty. And how did you get up on my windowsill? No, don't answer that. Hang on a moment. I dreamt that part too. I dreamt that a giant put you there. He did, Your Majesty, Sophie said. The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face. Control yourself, Mary, the Queen said sharply. Then to Sophie she said, You are not serious about that giant, are you? Oh, yes, Your Majesty. He's out there in the garden right now. Is he indeed? The Queen said. The sheer absurdity of it all was helping her to regain her composure. So, he's in the garden, is he? She said, smiling a little. He's a good giant, though, Your Majesty, Sophie said. You need not be frightened of him. Oh, I'm delighted to hear of that, the Queen said, still smiling. He's my best friend, Your Majesty. Oh, how nice, the Queen said. The way the Queen is reacting is telling me she doesn't really believe that there's a giant out there. He's a lovely giant, Your Majesty. Oh, I'm quite sure he is, the Queen said. But why have you and this giant come to see me? I think you have dreamt that part too, Your Majesty, Sophie said calmly. That pulled the Queen up quick. It took the smile right off of her face. She certainly had dreamt that part of it. She was remembering now how at the end of her dream it had said that a little girl and a big friendly giant would come and show her how to find the 9 horrible man-eating giants. But be careful, the Queen told herself. Keep very calm, because this is surely not far from the place where the madness begins. You did dream that, didn't you, Your Majesty? Sophie said. The maid was out of it now. She just stood there, goggling. Yes, the Queen murmured. Yes. Now that you come to mention it, yes, I did. But how do you know what I was dreaming about? Oh, well, that's a long story, Your Majesty, Sophie said. Would you like for me to call the big friendly giant up? The Queen looked at the child. The child looked straight back at the Queen, her face open and quite serious. The Queen simply didn't know what to make of all of this. Was someone pulling her leg? She wondered. Shall I call for him? Sophie went on. You'll like him very much. The Queen took a deep breath. She was glad no one except her faithful old Mary was here to see what was going on. Very well, she said. You may call your giant. No, wait a moment. Mary, pull yourself together and give me my dressing gown and my slippers. The maid did as she was told. The Queen got out of bed and she put on a pale pink dressing gown and slippers. You may call him now, the Queen said. Sophie turned her head toward the garden and called out, BFG, Her Majesty the Queen would like to see you. All right, I'm going to stop there because I think that's another cliffhanger. However, there were a couple pictures that I wanted to show you. So this was the Queen's maid, Mary, opening the curtain and seeing Sophie. And then this was the Queen reading in the newspaper. And then there was one more picture. This is just Sophie sitting on the windowsill after they opened it. All right. I hope you guys have a great Wednesday, and we will keep reading tomorrow.